our good friend Jamie Ivey, who many of you know. Hi, Jamie.
Hi.
Today, and I'm so excited because Jamie, as you probably know, she is a well-known author, speaker, and probably most famous for her podcast, The Happy Hour, which is the 1 hour that you can just get happy. And so Jamie's going to talk with us because we actually got connected, and Jamie got connected with Women of Welcome because she agreed to go on an immersion trip with us to the border to El Paso last year, where we did like a host of things. We met with Border Patrol, we met with local churches and ministry leaders that were serving in the area. And then we went over to Juarez and we met with migrant families and shelters, which was just shocking and hard, but it was a whirlwind trip, right? It was like only a day and a half.
It's like you blinked and we were on our way home. I mean, that's what it felt like.
We're just like drinking from a fire hose and soaking in as much as we could. So it was like, hi, you're Jamie. Hi, we're Women of Welcome. Here we go. And this is what it is. But we're going to get to that story and just kind of some big takeaways that Jamie had and why she cares about this issue like we do. But what I want to talk about first is I want to lay some groundwork as to not only hearing and coming away with a great story, but hopefully what this conversation will do is allow us to come away with a new mindset, one that we didn't have before, about the importance of sharing our story. And the reason why this is great that Jamie's talking about this with us is because Jamie has a new resource out, a new Bible study called Your Story Matters. And it's a 6-week study that's great. It's affordable. You can do it with your girlfriends. And so we're going to also hear just a little bit about that too. But that's what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about why our stories matter, why our stories of compassion matter. And it's so relevant for us in this community because so many of us feel compassion for this issue of immigrants and refugees. And yet we lack the confidence to move forward and share why we feel so compelled in this compassion. And so Jamie's going to talk us through some of the big barriers, some of the big lies in her study. She talks about 6 lies that prevent us from sharing our story, that the enemy tells us is true about why we're not able to share our story. And so we're gonna talk about that. So hopefully we're just gonna have one part. We might have 2 parts, just depending on how this goes. But without further ado, I'm gonna start asking Jamie some questions, and let's get equipped and encouraged about how we can start sharing our story to advocate for others well. So welcome, Jamie.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Okay, so you have a podcast. I think it's important to know that in your podcast, I mean, you love hearing people's stories. You've heard thousands of people's stories, hundreds of stories a year, and yet you sit in the listener chair. Mm-hmm. You're asking, why is that so important to be on that side, in that seat, the listener chair?
Well, I always say my life has been changed through my job. Listening to hundreds of women's stories a year over the past 6 years, I have heard experiences from women and men now that we have on the show that I haven't experienced myself. And if I've learned anything in the past 6 years, my number one thing I would probably say, well, I don't know if it's the number one, I've learned a lot, but one of the big things I've learned is how much proximity matters into what we believe. A couple of years, we lived in the house we live in now for 4.5 years. Previous to that, we lived on the east side of Austin in what we would call maybe an under-resourced, underdeveloped neighborhood. And that proximity changed my view on so many people in America. Now that we have adopted and we are a transracial family, my view on what it is like to be a Black person in America has changed because of my proximity with people in my family. And so the Happy Hour, my podcast, it's done that for me. I have interviewed women who have been through things that I've never been through, who have experienced things I've never experienced. And because of that, I've gotten to see things through their lens for just a minute. And so I think it's important to know how to listen well. And we live in a day and age where it's hard to listen. We feel like if we're listening, we don't get to say what we're thinking. And maybe I'll be misunderstood because if I listen to you and I don't agree with you, then you think I agree with you. And we just forget how to listen. This morning, Ravi Zacharias just passed away. And I saw a friend of mine, Jackie Hill Perry, put up a comment at a post about him. And she said how her and Preston, when they went to meet him, were so nervous. I mean, he is like a giant in our faith, right? Like one of the best apologetics that has lived in a long time. Like he's just him. And she said that when they went into his office, he started asking them all kinds of questions about them. And she said, what I learned about him is that he listened that day. And I even read that this morning on Instagram, and I knew that you and I were talking, and I just thought, man, it is so important to listen. And so I'm thankful that my job allows me to be able to do that. And in fact, just listening like that is how I even found out about you guys and got connected, was just through interviewing people that had done work with you guys already. And I think listening has made me a better teller of stories, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And not like a teller of stories, like I'm writing nonfiction books over here, but teller of my own stories, teller of your stories, teller of other women's stories. Because when we listen, we get to learn things that we wouldn't have heard had we been thinking too fast. Like sometimes our brain works so fast that we forget to listen. And so I'm a big fan of listening, and God's taught me a lot in listening.
Okay. So again, I feel like there's a lot of women in our community who are really content, and it could just be whatever your Enneagram number is, chalk it up to that. But sometimes we feel really content to just stay in the listener seat and not switch the role at all and be the storyteller. So how do we know when it's time to be courageous and make that transition and share our story of compassion, even when it's hard? How do we know?
This is hard. And I know we're going to talk about it in a minute, like how we should do that. You know, there's social media, there's friend relationship, there's people you work with. And it's difficult because we live in a world where there's a lot of noise. There is a lot of noise. Am I right? Like, I mean, how you open your phone and it's like, it's just coming at you, so much noise. And so there's a little bit part of you that thinks, how do I even get a voice in the noise? Like, how do I even say anything? How do I even know where to start? You know, especially when talking about things like that we're talking about with compassion and immigration. This goes back to my other point a little bit, is the reason that we would want to share these things and what God is doing in our life and what we're learning, instead of just being content, just listening. Mm-hmm. Here's why. And hear me, listen to the whole thing before you get upset. I think a lot of times things don't really affect us, so we don't feel like we can talk about it, or we should, or we even want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. That is a lot of women's reality in our country. Something that is in the news current right now that I can use as an example is Ahmaud Arbery. I have 3 children who are Black. Yeah. It affects me, and so I want to talk about it. Right. And I know a lot of women who this does make them mad, and they think this is not okay and this is not right. But then in 3 days, it doesn't bother them anymore. Right. Because it's off the news, you know, and so we move on. And so I think that we have to be people who see things through the lens of the gospel and see things the way that God sees them. And so, and it's hard, Bree, because there are a million things that should frustrate us about the brokenness and humanity of the world. And so I think just when we start to be women who say, I'm going to listen and I'm going to learn, which you guys are doing so well here by educating, so well in educating women. And then it comes to a point where you have to say, I think this matters. Like, I actually believe that this is important. And if people are in your Facebook group and they're following you guys, I don't know how they don't get to a point where they say this matters, because you're educating and encouraging them so well. And then you get to a point where you go, I can't not say anything. Like, that's I have to do something. I can't not say anything. I remember, speaking of my happy hour, and Tess Clark came on the show, I don't know, a year and a half ago, something like that. And I had originally heard her when she was on The Daily. Remember this? If your people remember this, she was on The Daily. And I remember, Bree, when I had her on, like, she came down, we interviewed, and I thought it was an amazing interview. And when the show released, it's almost like I kind of like was like this, like, I told my assistant, I said, don't send me any emails. Don't tell me what they say, because I was thinking people are going to be upset. No one said a thing. Like, no emails came in, no messages. I was shocked. But what it taught me was like that my heart had become compassionate for something. And I couldn't not do it. And that's where that landed me. And so I think when we're talking about how do we speak about these things, they have to matter to us. And if it matters to us, then it'll be an overflow of our heart.
Right. And just like you said, once you get to that point where you feel compelled to take a bold step forward or a courageous step forward to do something. You know, the number one question we have at Women of Welcome is, what can I do? And what we continue to tell people is there is no silver bullet, but the closer in proximity you can get to people who are affected by our immigration system, by the lack of justice in our system, the closer you can get to families who are vulnerable because of the issues that exist in our country, the more you're going to just get it.
Yeah.
I mean, we can put out every FAQ under the sun, but until you actually start getting close in proximity, things are probably just going to continue to swirl a bit.
Yeah. And can I just say this too, because I think a lot of people would then be wondering, like, well, how do I get close in proximity? And I know you guys have 1,000 ways, but I just know from my personal experience is like, you're probably close in proximity and you don't even know it. Like it's like, if you go anywhere in the world, you probably are interacting with someone who has been affected by our immigration policies. And so for me, this happened a handful of years ago at a place that we frequent often. We became friends with people that work there. And I found out that the daughter was brought here as a baby from her parents, both of them immigrants. None of them had legal status, and they've been working here she's like 20 now, you know, like they've been here forever. She's DACA, all the things. And that was when everything was happening. It was all in limbo at the very beginning about what was going to happen to all of these, you know, thousands of children. And when she told me her story, it was like everything I saw in the media had a new light on it, because I didn't just think about them. I thought about her. And I didn't just think about those people. I thought about our friends that we see once a month when we go to this place. Does that make sense? And so for me, I'm like, I think if you just look around, you probably interact with some people who have been affected, whether or not them personally or their family or something. And when I heard her story, it changed everything for me. It changed everything.
You're right. And, you know, I say this quote a lot, and I actually have to admit, I've never read a Shane Claiborne book. I haven't. But this quote that he said has always stuck with me. And that is, he said, I'm convinced that it's not that rich Christians don't care about the poor. It's that they don't know the poor. And I thought, like, that's it. We're not in close proximity to the vulnerable. We like to write a check. We like to feel good about solving a problem that was presented to us. But when it talks about getting involved in the messy for the long haul, because that's real life with people, it's, you look around and there's not a ton of people who are willing to walk it out for the long haul.
Yeah, it's so true.
For the long haul. So
it's so true.
Again, why our story matters about it gets personal for you, and you start to know people that have a story and you can share that. So this moves us right into, and I wrote this down so I make sure that I'm saying this right, but in your new study, you talk about the 6 lies that keep people from sharing their stories. And I cherry picked just 3 that I thought were pretty relevant for our specific community. And I'm just going to read them right here from my notes. And it says, for us, I feel like the number one thing is our story doesn't matter. You know, sharing our concern for immigrants and refugees really won't make that much of a difference. The second lie I think is relevant for our community out of the 6 that you pointed out was people will think less of me. Talking about this issue turns people away. They'll peg me as a liberal. They'll give me a really unfair label, and I will be kind of seen as an outcast with my community, which I'm pretty comfortable in, right? And then the third lie is no one will understand. And I think in particular for us, no one wants to hear. No one wants to be bothered with these people that don't even have status. No one wants to be bothered with people that might need assistance or help. And, you know, they'll say, I'm not an expert in immigration related information, and it's intimidating to talk about. So I'm going to do a terrible job doing it anyway, and people aren't going to necessarily care to hear it or understand. So let's kind of like talk through these, because you're the perfect one to do it with. You wrote the study about it. So let's talk about it. Number 1, your story doesn't matter. If you're feeling compelled and you're feeling compassion for immigrants and refugees, some of these really hard topics, dispel this lie for us that the story doesn't matter.
Well, I think for this, if we're going to talk about just this, you know, this us being voices and advocates for the least of these, and voices and advocates for people who don't have status in our country. There are so many times that we would think like, well, who am I? I all of these lies I've struggled with all my life in all different scenarios. And when we're just talking about being a voice for the voiceless, which they have a voice, that's just we're not listening to it. So being a voice for the people who people aren't listening to, we'll say it that way, has always been, there's all these fears that can come up. And the first one that we're talking about is that my story doesn't matter. And so, I can think about, okay, so who cares that I went to Juarez and met with people? Like, am I gonna change a system? Like, I don't have a direct line to the president's and immigration writers, so I would start to believe, like, does it really matter? Or who cares that I volunteered at the jail with women who, some of them are living out the same story that we're talking about? Like, who cares? I'm another person. But here's where I think we mistake, is that I really believe, like we've already said this before, is that God uses stories in unique and remarkable ways. And so one of the ways that he uses our own personal stories is he allows people to see the gospel through us. And it's this beautiful mystery that I could be someone who could show people Jesus just through my life. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we talk about that with our kids all the time. Like, we want people to see Jesus in you. And part of that is to trust that our story and the things he's writing and the things he's putting on our heart, that they matter, not because I'm awesome and not because Jamie Ivey has anything to say, but because God is working in me. Therefore, I get to show people how he could work in them. It's like this little domino effect. And we can all think of stories and like examples where someone has shared something about their life, and all of a sudden they go, oh, like, if she can get through that, or if she can experience that, or if she can volunteer there, maybe I can. And so I think that we start to believe that lie, that our story doesn't matter, because we're not viewing it as God writing our story. And so God has particular reason for all the women in this group. It's not like just an accident that you showed up here. And it's not like you just stumbled across this Facebook page. And it's not like you just accidentally started to care for the immigrants. Like, God has placed that in you. And so your story and your journey of learning, it actually really does matter. And I heard someone one time say that discipleship is just teaching someone behind you the things you know. And so it's intimidating for me, even to be completely honest and vulnerable, to sometimes even have these conversations, because I'm like, I don't know everything. Like, I'm like this far into knowing anything, but yet I might know more than the person I'm talking to. And so then we get to journey through it together. And so I think when we get so afraid that we don't personally matter, then we can believe that God can't use our stories. And when we flip that script and go, okay, God, I trust you. Like, I trust that you're putting this in me. I trust that you're going to help me through this. And then we can go forth and share what we're learning along the way, which is what all these ladies in this group are doing. They're educating themselves every time they show up on your page. And so it does matter that they're changing, and it does matter to their community and their families and their churches that God is moving in their hearts.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because when I came back from, I think that last year, I took 2 trips across the border. And the second time I came back from my trip, out of the woodwork, I had women messaging me on my Facebook, like, hey, I know we don't know each other that well, or hey, I know we haven't connected in years, but can you tell me about your trip? Could I take you out to coffee? I'm telling you that next Sunday when I went to church, I had 10 women come up to me and say, is Women of Welcome taking another trip to the border? Can I go? I have a list of women who are ready to pull the trigger and go. And I'm shocked. I mean, I don't know what your response was when you came back home. Were people like, oh my gosh, sit down and
tell me more? 100%. Because here's what I have learned too, and I'll use myself and my show as an example, is there's been a handful of shows I put on, Tess is one of them, where I kind of sat and waited for the grenades to be thrown at me. Like, people, because like you said, one of the questions, like, people think less of me, you said they're going to think I'm really liberal or something. And I think that we can get into some of these issues that aren't actually political issues. They're like justice issues and they're humanity issues. That's what, like, yes. And so, but then the current climate that we live in, not just current, this has been happening for way longer than the past, 3 years, but the current climate that we live in, 2020, these issues have become political. And so then we think, well, if I say something, they're going to think I'm a flaming liberal. And then what are they going to think? And I've actually don't care if you think I am or not. Like, I literally don't. I actually do not care. I think it was Dr. Moore one time actually say, Russell Moore, president of ERLC, I think he actually said, and I hope I'm not misquoting him. We can ask him next time we see him. But I think he said something like, I want to be too liberal for the conservatives and too conservative for the liberals. Like, I wanted to kind of be like where you're wondering, where is she standing on things? Because Jesus was like that.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus was totally like that, like he went and had dinner with the people who said, why are you hanging out with them? And he healed on days when they said, you're not supposed to heal, because he cared about people. I got off on a rabbit trail right there. But
that's perfect, because it just leads into the fact that when Jesus did these things that seemed radical or seemed too political, people thought less of him. They didn't think he was the savior. They didn't think he was the guy. They thought that there's no way someone would act this way if they were the Son of God. If he was the Messiah, he wouldn't be flipping over tables in the synagogues. He wouldn't be having dinner with tax collectors. He wouldn't be talking about things that we don't understand. He would come to take over and save. And that's the lie, is people will think less of me if I speak up and be brave, which tends to happen, right? You say something about this issue, and then there's like the trolls come out of the woodwork. It's important, but
here's the problem with this Bible study that I found out, and I know I'm the one that created it, so I don't know why I didn't think about the problem before. But here's the problem with it: is yes, these are lies. Yes, they can keep us in bondage. Yes, we can start to believe these to be true, so they keep us from sharing our concern, our compassions, our stories, all the things. But here's the problem, Brie. Sometimes these are actually true. You know what I mean? Like, you can buy into the lie that everyone's going to think less of you, and that is a lie. Everyone's not going to think less of you. But some people might. That's what's hard about it, is that some people might. Some people may not understand. Some people may think that I have lost my marbles and gone to the other side. But this is also leads into that with like sharing our story and sharing our compassion, is we have lost, some of us, let me think how to say this. Sometimes we forget how to talk about things in a way that is Christ-centered and gospel-centered. And so, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of them can be hard places for that to happen. And I think there's a time and a place for that. But here's what I'm so interested in when I talk with women about sharing their story, and in the context we're using here, sharing about what God is teaching them to be compassionate about, the people that he's compassionate about, is I want that to happen in my everyday, regular life. Like, there's a time and a place to make an Instagram post. And because of my world, I do a lot of things online. So that's where a lot of I can do that because that's what I do, right?
Right.
But you know when I really want to have these conversations is when someone at my kids' football game says, can you believe that those guys are taking over our country? That's when I want to be able to say, oh man, can I tell you what I feel about that? Or can I explain something? And so that is when I think we as women get to stand up and be confident and be compassionate, because that is a person in real life that you can see, you can touch, you can see emotions. There's no like, just say whatever I want online and make everybody mad. That's where I want to stand up for things, is in those conversations. That's where I want to be someone in my community that maybe changes the mindset of what someone has had for years and years and years, because they've never heard someone who loves Jesus so much talk about this issue like that. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. Yeah. I once had a friend of mine, and he said, I really like what you're doing. You've started, you're kind of caring about that thing that you care about. And I said, the thing that I care about? And he said, yeah, all the stuff that you care about now. And I said, I feel like, isn't that what the church is supposed to be caring about? Like, it shouldn't just be my thing. I mean, we all have passions that were ignited and giftings, and that's what the body of Christ is, with all the different body parts. My passion doesn't have to be your passion, but as the church as a whole, we should be leaning in, no matter, this is a biblical issue, right? And this leads us into the third thing, where it says, no one will understand, or I'm not going to deliver it well. This is going to be super imperfect. I'm very intimidated. I'm going to get run over. No one will understand. I'm going to do it ineffectively. What do you say about that?
I say this is a very real fear that I probably live in this space a little bit, and so here's what I've learned is this fear of no one's going to understand is, I remember when I came back from that trip with you guys, which was just so fabulous. And I'm never going to talk about some things that I learned and that kind of thing. I remember when I came back and I thought, I don't know how to adequately explain what I saw and what I felt, because it felt like, it's almost like that song from Hamilton. Like, you had to be in the room when it happened. Like, you had to be there. Like, I don't know how to explain this. But then what I really started to understand, and what I guess God really helped me see, is that people, when they were asking questions, they actually wanted to know what I thought. Like, they actually wanted to know what I saw. They actually wanted to know what I felt. And so when people are asking you questions, for the most part, now there are some people who are just like out to start a fight, but listen, you shouldn't be hanging out with them anyways. But the people, I'm kidding about that. But when people would come to me after that trip, or if I were to put a show up that was about, something that might be quote unquote controversial, and people are asking honest questions, they actually really want to know. Like, they want to learn, they want to understand. And so the fear that no one's going to understand, or no one's going to care about that, again, will there be people who don't understand, who don't care? Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's just, we're dealing with broken people. I'm broken. I've had to walk through and learn things that people have talked to me about, but also like people who want to know will understand. I talked about this morning. I actually did a Facebook Live with this Bible study, and I actually talked about this live and talked about this webinar that we were going to be doing right now. And I told them about how this conversation about no one will understand and no one will care ties in so much with you invited me on to have this conversation, as well, as because that journey for me of the past 2 or 3 years of having my eyes open to the realities of what people might endure in our country just because of where they were born. And then that journey down to Juarez that you guys invited me on, and just other things that I've gotten to be a part of and just kind of listen, like a lot of listening and learning, those have become a part of my story. Like, I can't separate myself from those things anymore. And so for me to fear that I can't talk about it because no one will understand, this is what it is. It would be like you having the fear of not inviting me on the trip because I don't understand what you're passionate about. Does that make sense? And so when we get the opportunity to share with people the parts of our story that have changed us, for you guys watching, that's probably the parts of learning about being compassionate for those that were not born here, that don't have status here. That compassion, and when you use that compassion to tell others about it, you're actually inviting them into learning. Like, you're giving them an opportunity to know more. And it's almost like we're hoarding knowledge, and you think like, I don't have a lot of knowledge, I don't know that much, but you do know something because you're here. Like, and you do care because you're here. And so that you have a voice in it. And so that knowledge, what you've learned, for you to hoard that would be doing the exact opposite of what someone did for you to get you where you are here now. Make sense?
Yes. Makes sense. Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's say you want to take a brave step forward and you want to share your story of why you feel compassion or why you feel compelled that this issue is so important. Okay, so the biggest place to do that would probably be online. And probably, to me, one of the most intimidating places to do it is online, because you don't know what's going to come at you. So how would we navigate how to take the plunge online? What would be your suggestion?
My first suggestion is to not show up with guns blazing. All of you are wrong, I am right. And you can just take that and use that for the rest of your life for everything. Okay. I think what a lot of times happens is we learn about an issue and become so passionate about it that we want to shame everybody for not caring. And it comes from a good place. It comes from you going, oh my gosh, I can't believe I know this now. You should know this and you should care. I think about other journeys in my life. Like, I have my best friend, her daughter has special needs. She's 17 now. I didn't know anyone parenting a kid with special needs before my best friend. And so my knowledge has grown so much that now there's natural tendencies of ways I will talk about things online that have to do with people with special needs, because I've learned from her. And so it's not that I've ever gone online and put up a post about, let me just think of something. Like, it's not like I've never gone online saying, if you have ever used the R word, you're going straight to hell and you're the worst person in the world.
Right.
That would be guns blazing. I think it's an inappropriate word to use. I really do. And I don't use it. I don't like it in vocabulary. But I've learned that through my friend. And so for online, what that would mean for me is maybe showcasing other people who have a voice in that space and sharing their words with people. Does that make sense? So instead of me coming out being like, okay, I now know everything about immigration and I would like to tell you everything and here's why you should care. It would mean me bringing other people who are also talking about it to my audience. Now, I have like an amazing job and I get to do that every week. I get to bring people in front of my audience and say, listen to these smart people tell their stories. But you, if you're on Facebook, if you're on Instagram, Twitter, you get to do the same thing in a way, is you get to share like, oh my gosh, I was listening to this webinar and I heard this. And then there it is. So it's almost like you're just adding conversation into what you would normally say and normally post about. There are a lot of stories out there that most people would feel compassionate about, no matter where they land on what side of the spectrum. And so for me, a lot of times it's a good thing to highlight these stories, to bring out the compassion of people towards something that they might not have even known they needed compassion for. If that makes sense, like to highlight stories of people's lives in ways that you might not have normally. Recommending books, like I remember I read, what's Sarah's book's called? Book, give Sarah a shout out. Without love. Say it again.
Love Undocumented.
I mean, even like when I read that, it was the first time I ever heard a story like that. And so for me, I got to share that online. And that was not me coming out guns blazing, throwing my opinion out, but it was like, hey, read this woman's story. And I think you'll learn something from it. I think it is how we can do things just like naturally with the natural rhythm. And is there a place for guns blazing? Sure, of course. I don't find my place there very well. Like that's not the kind of person I am.
Yeah. And we talk about how these issues, when you start to dig into human dignity issues, there's a lot of nuance there. And so coming out guns blazing, as you said, doesn't necessarily open the space for a nuanced conversation. You're definitely putting people on the defensive. And so this kind of leads us into the next one. I've had friends who have tried to have this conversation in person with family members, with deep friends in their community, and it has gone completely awry. And there's a lot of hurt feelings. There's a lot of misunderstanding. I thought you were one of us, and now you're talking about this. And walk us through what might be the safest or the most effective way to have hard conversations, something like this in person.
Would you like me to tell you the 87 ways I failed? Can we start there? This is real life and this is hard. And we see this in election years. I mean, we see this all the time. I have had, like I can think of a particular instance, Bree, where I had to apologize to my parents for the way I handled a conversation. It wasn't about this, but it was something that felt kind of divisive, and I became very defensive and very angry. And I got to a place where I don't ever want to be, which the place is, how could you not see what I'm saying?
Right.
And I learned in that argument, and if my sweet mom watches this, like I apologized 1,000 times because I crossed the line. Like I crossed the line. And I think that there are so many issues of just human dignity where it can get this way with friends and family. One of the main things I learned from that conversation is that I was expecting that conversation, my parents, I was expecting them to listen well to me, but I was refusing to listen well to them. And that was a big fail for me, because in my mind, in the point, I was like, I don't need to listen to this because I already know I don't agree with this. But yet I wanted them to listen to me, even though they already knew they didn't agree with me. And so we did not have a civil conversation. And I will never forget that. I'll never forget where we were sitting, the restaurant. I mean, listen, I remember everything about it because it was not the way you should handle a hard conversation. So one of the things that I learned, like I just said, is to really listen well. And I think that sometimes it's hard for us to listen to something that in our brain doesn't make sense at all. Like there's absolutely no way I could think that you actually believe that. but we want people to listen to us. And so I think there's this common respect that we need to be able to give. I also think there's this idea that we come in and we think that we are going to be the person in one conversation to change someone's mind, and then they'll come over to our side and everything will be perfect. And like you said, the nuances around all of these issues, there's thousands of them. And so I don't think anymore, I don't carry that burden on my shoulders anymore that I need to be the person to change anyone's mind. But what I do have the burden of is I want to be bold and confident in what I'm saying in a kind way. Like, how about this? How about we just act like Jesus? Okay. Like, here's the deal. We just act like Jesus. Jesus was bold. Jesus was confident, and Jesus was so loving and so gracious. And so it's not that Jesus never said all things that were true, because he told the truth. He was a truth saying person. But Jesus, he was also kind. He was also gracious. He was also loving. And so I think that when we're talking with people in person is, number one, take the burden off yourself. Well, number one, listen well. Number two, take the burden off yourself as being the person that's going to change their mind. But what if you were just the person that showed them, like I said earlier, that someone who really, really loves Jesus can have a different opinion than theirs? Like, that's what has been one of the biggest game changers for me, is when I see people that I know they love Jesus as much as I do. Like, I love Jesus. They do too. And we see things differently. It's caused me to think a little bit about them. And so what if you're the first person that they have a conversation with that doesn't tell them that they're awful, that they're going to hell, that they're miserable people because they don't care about all life from, birth to death and all the things? Like, what if you just came at them and you loved them and you shared what you thought in a loving way and you didn't put them down? I think that is one of the hardest things to do, is that you want to tell them how wrong they are. Like, you want to show them this is how wrong you are. And right. I want to do that. But I've learned in marriage and parenting in these conversations that starting out telling someone how wrong they are, it usually never works out well. Like, it just doesn't go over well. You can use that in all of life as well, friends, like all of the life. But when we come to them and we're like, hey, I'm willing to listen to you if you're willing to listen to me. I don't carry the burden of having to change your mind, but I just want to show you what I think about things. And you can see that I still love Jesus. You can see that I still love Jesus.
Well, and I also think, just like what you said, like, take the burden off. Like, you're not looking to solve the world or to change a person in one conversation. But I mean, hello, the big component, and probably one of the main reasons why you have compassion stirred within you, is because of the Holy Spirit. You are not the Holy Spirit. A lot of these times when we enter these conversations, we got to backtrack a bit and say, before I'm entering these conversations, I'm going to just get on my knees and ask Jesus that he be in the conversation, and that a seed is planted. Not that we're going to sprout an oak tree today, but Lord, be with my words. Help me have compassion. Help me not become impatient. And Lord, you do what you do.
Yep.
You do what you do in their heart that you do for me.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah. And when people have shown you compassion, when you have had a lack of awareness and understanding, you know how amazing that feels when people are gracious with you.
100%. Yep.
Yep. I remember I went to Oaxaca before I went to El Paso. And when I was in Oaxaca, we were in an unaccompanied minor shelter. And it was like the Holy Spirit just kind of like dropped some kind of veil. And I just remember having to walk, just with a group of wonderful women, I had to walk into another room, and I just like buried my face in a corner, and I just started bawling. And, one of the women came in and she was like, oh my gosh, are you okay? And I couldn't make out words. And another lady walked in, she'd been in this issue for years, just so experienced. And she just said, she'll be okay. She's mourning the fact that she's missed this. She'll be fine. Let's just leave her alone. Just like, no one tried to come in and like fix it for me or explain. It was just like, I see it. I'm going to let the Holy Spirit do what he's doing. And I just felt such compassion in that issue and in that moment.
Yeah.
It just so gracious.
Yeah.
I felt so kind.
And I think on that, I think that's a beautiful story. And I've had moments of that in my life. I remember when like sex trafficking first opened, my eyes were first opened to that it happens like in our country, in my city, down the road from where I live. Like, I was never the same after that. And so I think one of the things we have to remember too, is when we're having these conversations with people, is I mean, there are so many issues of human dignity or social justice, whatever you want to call them, that there are so many of these things that people could literally go their entire lives and never know about or have to think about because they don't directly affect them.
Right.
People coming in seeking asylum at the border does not affect most people in this country. It just doesn't.
Right.
It just doesn't. Women being trafficked in our country, it just doesn't affect a lot of people in our country. The foster care services in our country and how they need so much reform doesn't affect a lot of people. And so what I've learned in my life is that there's been times, like you just said, you had that moment and that what she said to you was so beautiful as you were mourning what you didn't know. There's been so many times in my life that I've come to a point and gone, I could have gone my whole life and not cared about this. And that does make you go to a moment of like, man, I don't want to not care about these things. Like, I don't want to go my whole life and find out there was this other tragedy that I never knew about. And so when we're talking with people around us, one of the things that is hard, depending on what point you are in your journey, is to think like, you might be telling someone something that they've never heard before their entire life.
Right.
Like you might be telling a suburban mom that what she hears on the news, that immigrants come in and don't take all of our jobs and don't pay taxes and all the things. You might be telling her that that's actually not a true statistic. She would have never heard that before. And so to be aware that your little bit of knowledge could be the very, very first thing that anyone's ever thought about an issue before. And man, if you get to be the person to do that for someone, that's an honor. It really is. And you don't have to be, on the board of, Welcome Women, or you don't have to be on the immigration status policy board of whatever to be able to open someone's eyes for the first time. And so there's that compassion that we can also look around at our communities and our neighborhoods and know, wow, there's people living in this community that never, ever have to think about it. And they only know what they see on the news. They only know what they see on the news. And so the news is not giving us, it doesn't matter who's in office. It doesn't matter who's in office. The news is not giving us a gospel portrayer of how we take care of human lives. It doesn't matter the issue. No one is coming at it through the lens of the gospel. And as Christ followers, that's what we have to do. We have to look at every issue through the lens of the gospel. And so that means that every life has dignity. And if someone's never heard that before, you're going to see their mind blown.
Right. I mean, and with this issue in particular, first of all, I love what you said about no news station is going to give you a gospel filtered setup to a story or the gospel centered nuance. We might feel like whatever news station we're listening to is going to be the closest thing to whatever a biblical mindset would be. That's actually not the case. I mean, there's sometimes even our pastors get it wrong, sometimes. So how would we rely on some kind of news station to do that for us? But yet we let that craft the narrative for us. And so we have to be wise and discerning about that. But speaking of coming to this issue and starting to learn, how did you come to this issue? Like, how did this get important for you? When did it kind of open for you?
So the family that I told you that I met was the first family I had contact that I knew of that was affected by what had happened when all of that DACA stuff first came out.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so all of a sudden, for the first time, what I'm seeing on the news and what I'm hearing from a friend is not making sense. And so that caused me to actually care about the issues. And again, golly, I hope I would have said I cared. I mean, I hope I would have, but it didn't affect me. It wasn't a part of my life. I read a book, Shannon Martin, Shannon.
I love that.
She's the one that told me about Sarah's book. So I read Sarah's book. I remember this is where I read a lot of books in the bathtub, but I remember reading it. And so I remember where I was when I read that book because it was just so moving to me. And it opened my eyes up to so much I had never even contemplated before. And then there was one more book that I read, and I cannot remember the name of it. I'll try to get it to you and then you can share one more book. But it was just and also probably 5 years ago, I started volunteering in our local jail. And so volunteering in a jail, every issue of human dignity is coming to light. Everything. There's not one that's not going to be touched. And so that was really good for me as well. And so I was actually sitting with people who the news was telling me what to think about them. Does it make sense?
Right.
So my eyes and my heart and everything just started to change a little bit. And I just had conversations on my podcast about things. And so my eyes started to open up and I started to listen more. Tess came on the show. I went to Mexico with you guys, and it just became something that I, all of a sudden, like I said, I hope I wouldn't have said I didn't care before, but I didn't know much about before. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So I know we're kind of winding down on an hour here, but I really want to know, when you went with us to El Paso and Juarez, we heard from a lot of different people. We heard from local ministries. We met with the Border Patrol. We peppered them with all kinds of questions about security and all of these things. And then we went over and talked with migrant families in shelters over there. What was maybe your biggest takeaway or a story that has not left you since that trip with Welcome?
I remember when I first came home, my husband was like, tell me everything. Like, you have all the answers right. And I was like, I have 1 million more questions than when I went with. And that was a little bit confusing to me a little bit. I mean, meeting with the Border Patrol, I'll be honest, I went in, I mean, this is where media can harm both sides. So I went in thinking, these people are awful. They're mean. They're doing all, because I just saw the news.
Yeah.
And I left there going, okay, there might be a lot of policies that I don't agree with, but these are like real people trying to do their jobs. They're human people trying to do their jobs. Their hands are tied in so many ways that we don't know about. And so I remember leaving that conversation when we sat under that tree, just like, I thought I would leave here. This is not Christ-like what I'm about to say. I thought I would leave here really angry at them and be able to blame them. Does that make sense? I thought I'd be like, here's where the blame lies. And I left there with no answer. I left there feeling almost a little bit, I left there feeling compassionate for them. Like, I left there thinking, I don't know what to think, is what I left there with. And it was very, very confusing for me, that conversation with the Border Patrol was. And there's a lot of things about behind all those things. We were talking to PR people. Like, and I don't want to be mean. I've gone on a rabbit trail, Bree. All that to say, I had a lot more questions than when I got there. One of the things that stood out to me the most was, I don't know if you remember this. I'm sure you do. When we were not in Juarez, we were on the El Paso side, and we were at the wall. We were at the border, and we saw some women on the other side, and we started to have a conversation with them. And a lot of the conversation stood out to me, but I don't know if you remember this. They were out looking for stuff because they were making these craft bottles for their kids. Do you remember that?
Manipulatables?
Yep. They were making things that like our kids would play with in preschool, They
were like room moms.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember thinking, here I am, an American and white. There's the wall. And on the other side is a Mexican woman who the media would portray as an enemy. In some senses. I don't want to paint all the media bad. If y'all want to email me, just email Bree. That's what you need to do.
Yes. Keep sending that stuff.
The media, I mean, we can be honest about that sometimes they would portray. And I remember looking at her thinking, she is a mom just like me. Like, I don't know much about her story. I don't know why she lives in Juarez. I don't know and remember the story as if maybe she'd journeyed there or she'd been there her whole life. I think she'd been there forever. But all I remember thinking was, this is what changes people's perception and have compassion for people who look different than them, is they meet them and they see that their mom's just like them, finding toys so that their kids can get good fine motor skills.
Right.
And it was in that moment that I thought, I want everyone to know that wherever you fall on the line of conservative, liberal, whatever, on any of these subjects, what we can't ever forget is that we're talking about real people who are teaching their kids fine motor skills just like I am. And that really stood out to me. We also met when we were in Juarez, and we met with the man who had journeyed up to Juarez to try to seek asylum from Guatemala. And he told us his whole story. And it wasn't a new story to me. Like, I had heard stories like this of people trying to come in through the El Paso border to seek asylum for gangs, drug. Like, I've heard the stories, right? But I never heard it from someone that was actually the one doing it. I'd never sat across from someone. I'd never seen someone cry because they had to leave their family. I'd never seen someone cry because they didn't know if they were going to meet their baby daughter that had been born while they were gone. I had never seen someone talk about the reasons that he had to go because he would be killed. And so it was like everything, the stories that we hear that's at proximity, all of a sudden there was the story right in front of me. And I think that it became a lot more real to me to see this man who had 3 kids back home. He didn't abandon his family. He wasn't trying to come here to take our money. He wasn't dangerous. He loved the Lord. And I thought, if everything he told me happened to me, I'd do the same thing.
Well,
I'd do the same thing.
And when he was talking, I just kept thinking, where is the welcome?
Mm.
You know, like, his whole situation was it was survival mode. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he was trying to save a neighbor girl from abuse, and therefore it cost him, you know, that family ended up being affiliated with a gang, and then he had a hit on his life. And so then he had to leave his family in order to try and seek asylum and then send for them. And he still was seeking the Lord in that. He's sitting in a shelter in a holding pattern. And I'm just thinking, where is the welcome from the Christians in America towards those who are vulnerable? Mm-hmm. I personally looked at that long line of men that the media show you that are waiting along the fence line. I looked at that long line of single men so differently. Mm. Or I would see it as, yeah, those might be coming for reasons that are not good or whatnot. Hope our vetting process catches them and all of that. And yet then I started to just look at that line along the fence, like, that looks like a father. Mm-hmm. That looks like a brother. Mm-hmm. That looks like a child. Mm-hmm. Like you said, it just made it very real. Mm-hmm. That we cannot look away, that God loves them. And if they don't have a voice that anyone is listening to, and we have the privilege of a voice that people are listening to, what are we to do with that?
Yeah. I think it was also really, it was really good for me to see that it kind of changed my narrative a little bit. Of the narrative isn't like, open the doors and let anyone in.
No.
And so that's not the narrative at all. But what changed my narrative was not like, are you pro Trump's policies or not? But the narrative for me is now, as a Christian, as someone who follows Jesus, as someone who wants to do and be like Jesus, do you see these people as people made in his image? And so it helped me to kind of change a little bit, to not be so, this person, whoever that might be, will change the whole immigration system and make everything better. But it would be more of like, when I have conversations, like everyone in this group, we're wondering, how do I have these conversations with friends? It would be more of, and again, there are people here who are policymakers, and I'm so for them. I'm not like, I'm not going to DC. Like, I'm not going to make policy, but I am going to have conversations with people around me, you know? And we need policymakers, but we also need women just to remind other women that we're not just talking about those people, but we're actually talking about men and women who are made in the image of God, and they have to matter. They have to matter, or else everything we believe is just, I was going to say a bad word, but I'm a Christian, and so I won't. Everything we believe would be like just crap. Because
it will all fall apart.
It will all fall apart. Like, we can't just care about those that benefit us. And so, and I mean, Bree, we can have this conversation about so many things.
So many
things. And so I'm just grateful that you guys, I'm so grateful that you guys are educating me. I'm so grateful that you are encouraging conversation. I'm so glad also that this feels safe, that it feels like a safe place. And I think that that is one of the scariest things for women to engage in conversations like this, is they just don't know if it's going to be safe, because they've probably engaged before and been pushed down because of the engagement. And I'm so thankful that you guys are safe.
Well, that is one thing that we say, if you're in the general welcome community, we do have our private welcome women group, where that's the whole point of that private group, is to ask questions that you're afraid to ask, learn things that you're afraid of learning, find friendship and relationship, and go deeper in a safe place. So I hope that this conversation was helpful today. It was helpful for me. I'm always excited when I get to spend some time with you, Jamie. But again, today, I hope this is the biggest takeaway, is that your story of compassion, your reasoning for being compelled, is from the Holy Spirit. Yeah. And we want to point people to Jesus, and we can do that in this subject matter and even in this hard issue. And we only exist to glorify God. And if you feel compelled and you feel compassionate about this issue, you can do that through this. And your story matters. And if you want to dive deeper, I would highly encourage you to visit jamieivey.com, and that's IVEY.com, jamieivey.com, for her 6-week study, Your Story Matters. You're going to go through the 6 slides, super easy downloadable videos, and conversation guide for your group. So thank you, Jamie. We love you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.